Chapter 1. Before Louisiana was Louisiana. Long before the names Louisiana or New Orleans ever existed, before any European had carved a map of the Mississippi or claimed dominion over its waters, this vast, lush land pulsed with life. It was not empty. It was not wild in the way colonizers would later describe it. It was home. Home to powerful nations, ancient cities, sacred mounds, and generations of people who knew the land as intimately as we know the walls of our childhood homes. This is the forgotten prologue of Louisiana, the land before Louisiana. The Mississippi River didn't just flow through the land. It gave it breath. To its west sprawled prairies and pine forests. To the east, swamps and cypress-studded bayous. This ecological abundance offered everything: water for travel and agriculture, forests for shelter and tools, animals for food and trade. Louisiana was a natural crossroads, where rivers met rivers, where peoples met peoples. The ancient indigenous nations who lived here didn't just adapt to the land, they shaped it. They burned fields to attract game, managed riverbanks, and built intricate communities that blended seamlessly with the rhythm of the seasons. They didn't believe in owning the land. Instead, they belonged to it, and they thrived. Go back 3,400 years, and you'll find the astonishing sight of Poverty Point in present-day northeastern Louisiana. Here stood one of the earliest known complexes in North America, a monumental set of earthworks shaped like concentric semicircles, with massive mounds rising above the land. Long before the rise of the Maya or the Aztec empires, these early Louisianans were building. The people of Poverty Point were not merely primitive foragers. They were traders, artisans, and organizers. Artifacts from across the continent have been found there: obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, soapstone from the Appalachians. This was a hub, a market, a civilization. And yet, as with so many indigenous stories, mystery surrounds them. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their language. But we do know this: they lived in complex societies. They understood astronomy, and they left behind a legacy written in earth. In the northwest of what would become Louisiana, the Caddo people built a vast confederation of villages centered around the Red River. They lived in tall, beehive-shaped houses made of grass and timber, some clustered into mound centers used for ceremony and leadership. The Caddo were agriculturalists, growing corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. They also hunted deer and buffalo and fished the creeks. But more than that, they were diplomats and traders. Their influence stretched into Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Their society was hierarchical but not tyrannical. Power was shared among leaders in different villages, with respect for the spiritual as much as the political. When the Spanish and French later stumbled into Caddo territory, they were not greeted by savages, but by diplomats with centuries of experience in negotiation, exchange, and regional power dynamics. To the east, along the Mississippi River, rose the temples and towns of the Natchez people. Their culture was striking, structured, symbolic, and deeply spiritual. The Natchez believed in a sun god, and their great sun, both a leader and a divine figure, ruled from a capital city called Grand Village, not far from today's Natchez, Mississippi. Their society was rigidly stratified, divided into nobles and commoners, and their ceremonial practices included elaborate rituals that shocked European observers. Yet the Natchez were not merely religious curiosities. They were organized, skilled farmers and hunters, building villages that rose from the blufflands and overlooked the river's winding might. Their temples were perched atop massive earth mounds, with ceremonial plazas and sacred fires burning year-round. Tragically, their society would later face violent disruption from both the French and neighboring tribes under pressure from colonial expansion. But in this chapter of pre-Louisiana, the Natchez stood as one of the most distinctive and advanced cultures in North America. South and east of the Caddo and Natchez, the Choctaw people held sway over the dense pine forests and rolling hills. Known for their strong agricultural base and skill in diplomacy, the Choctaw were one of the largest tribal nations in the Southeast. They lived in rectangular homes made of mud and thatch, built permanent villages, and organized themselves into matrilineal clans. Their society prized balance between war and peace, trade and self-sufficiency, community and individual freedom. The Choctaw would later become pivotal players in colonial and American history, often navigating alliances with skill and pragmatism. But even before the arrival of the French or the Spanish, they were well connected through marriage, trade, and shared festivals with neighboring peoples. Beyond these larger nations, hundreds of smaller bands and tribes inhabited the wetlands, swamps, and coastlines, places that European settlers considered inhospitable, but where indigenous peoples thrived. The Chitimacha, who lived along the bayous and lakes of southern Louisiana, mastered the art of fishing, basket weaving, and water navigation. Their canoes skimmed through the mossy channels of the Atchafalaya Basin, and their stories echoed with the voices of ancestors and animal spirits. The Tunica, Avoyel, Huma, and Tayensa each added to the cultural mosaic, some later merging, some disappearing, some surviving under new names. This wasn't a single tribe living in Louisiana. It was a civilization of civilizations, a woven tapestry of languages, traditions, and cosmologies. These nations were not static. They moved, fought, allied, and evolved. Borders shifted. Migrations occurred. Stories were told and retold under stars and around fires. Trade routes ran like invisible rivers through the land. Salt, flint, fish, furs, and food moved in long arcs across the Southeast. A gift offered was a relationship opened. A broken treaty could spark generations of vengeance. Marriage was not just a personal matter. It was diplomacy. Names had power. Ceremonies held meaning that extended into politics and identity. There was no written law, yet every person knew the rules. And then the ships came. With them, disease, guns, missionaries, maps, and flags. Within a century of first contact, entire nations had vanished, lost not only to conquest, but to invisible enemies. Smallpox, influenza, measles. By the time the French began building forts, the population of indigenous Louisiana had been slashed by 2/3. Still, the survivors endured. They adapted, resisted, negotiated. Some, like the Huma, were forced south into the swamps where they live to this day. Others, like the Natchez, were destroyed in war, but none disappeared without leaving a mark. Before there was a Louisiana, there was a place older than flags, richer than any map could show, filled with memory, song, and earth. Before the first European claimed the land was already claimed by ancestors who spoke to the rivers, who danced under the stars, and who knew that nothing truly belongs to us, not even the land beneath our feet. As we move forward into the colonial past, we carry with us the stories of these first people, not as a footnote, but as the foundation of Louisiana's true beginning. Chapter 2. France claims the swamp. The land the French would one day call Louisiana had always been full of life, song, and memory. But for explorers in Parisian courts, peering at hastily drawn maps and dreaming of gold, it was something else entirely. It was a blank space, waiting for glory, a prize in the imperial game. And for Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, it was a river's mystery calling him south. In 1682, La Salle floated down the Mississippi River, his canoes cutting through still waters that mirrored the sky. The land around him was vast, humid, and strange to European eyes. Dense forests, steamy marshes, and twisting bayous that swallowed sound. When he finally reached the mouth of the river, he planted a flag in the mud and named the region in honor of King Louis XIV, La Louisiane. With a flourish and a prayer, France had claimed a new empire. But what they claimed and what they actually controlled were two very different things. La Salle dreamed of a thriving French colony in the Mississippi Valley, one that would connect Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. But dreams have a way of turning, especially when ambition outruns reality. When he returned with settlers years later, he missed the Mississippi entirely, landing instead on the Texas coast. Lost, desperate, and increasingly paranoid, La Salle was eventually murdered by his own men. His grand vision was buried in the mud. But France was not done. In 1699, two brothers, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville and Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, arrived to pick up where La Salle had failed. Sailing into the Gulf of Mexico, they moved up the river, scouting the land, meeting native tribes, and planting France's presence with cautious optimism. They built a fort called Maurepas near present-day Biloxi and began the difficult work of turning wilderness into colony. It wasn't easy. The land was beautiful but treacherous. Summer heat clung to skin like wet cloth. Mosquitoes carried fever. Crocodiles slid through black water. Trade routes were unreliable. But Bienville had a gift that few colonizers possessed: persistence. He saw the value of the river. He understood its potential. While Iberville would die of yellow fever just a few years later, Bienville remained stubborn as the swamp, determined to make France's claim a reality. In 1718, he founded the city that would become the heart of Louisiana, New Orleans. Built on a crescent bend in the Mississippi, it was meant to be strategic, defensible, and central to trade. But the city was also built on risk. The ground was barely above sea level. Floods were constant. Disease spread quickly in the humid air. And yet, despite its dangers, New Orleans grew. From the beginning, it was a city of contradiction. Built by enslaved Africans and French soldiers, populated by exiled criminals and desperate settlers, it was a rough place full of elegance, a chaotic mix of cultures that somehow worked. The architecture reflected French tastes. But the spirit of the city was already starting to shift into something entirely its own. To populate the colony, France didn't rely on noble volunteers. Instead, it sent men from prisons and women from orphanages or convents. Some came for opportunity, others came to escape disgrace. The colony was hungry for labor, for wives, for soldiers, and for farmers. It got what it could. The women who arrived in the early years often carried with them small wooden chests, cassettes, which is how they earned the nickname filles à la cassette, or casket girls. They were sent to marry the settlers, to bring some sense of stability to a wild land. But nothing about Louisiana was ever truly stable. The economy in these early years was built on ambition and suffering. France's colonial dreams were fueled by visions of sugar, indigo, and profit. To achieve that, they turned to slavery. Africans were shipped in by the thousands, their lives stolen and bodies forced into labor. On plantations and in households, in the fields and the kitchens, they built what France claimed as its own. Their languages, religions, and rhythms would seep into the soil, becoming part of Louisiana's soul, though no one asked them to. While Catholicism was the official religion, what took root in the colony was often a blend. Part African spirituality, part French tradition, part indigenous belief. The streets of New Orleans, even in these early decades, were already alive with a kind of cultural fusion that couldn't be planned and wouldn't be tamed. Meanwhile, Bienville fought off rivals and uprisings. The Natchez people, whose territory was being encroached upon by plantation settlements, rose in resistance in 1729, destroying Fort Rosalie and killing hundreds of French settlers. The French retaliated with brutality, attempting to crush the Natchez entirely. It was a bitter glimpse of what empire meant on the ground. Land taken, cultures destroyed, cycles of violence that echoed louder with each decade. Still, Bienville held on. He governed Louisiana 4 separate times, each return marked by more frustration, more struggle, more politics. He argued with colonial officials, begged for supplies, fought off English influence, and tried, always tried, to make New Orleans a city worthy of its royal name. By the time he left for good in 1743, he was tired, broken by the very dream he had helped build. But the city remained, and so did the idea of French Louisiana. Though the colony was never truly profitable, it became something more, a symbol of France's presence in the Americas. A foothold, a promise, a question mark. By the mid-17th century, New Orleans had grown into a functioning town with markets, churches, and streets that turned to rivers when it rained. The people were French, but also African, indigenous, Caribbean, and mixed. They danced, they fought, they prayed, and they gambled. They lived in a place constantly threatened by water, disease, and war. And yet, they stayed. Louisiana, in the French imagination, was an empire of possibility. But on the ground, it was something else. A colony too far from Paris to control, too diverse to define, too humid to civilize. It would not bend to France's will. It would become something else entirely. And as the winds of global conflict began to rise in Europe and the Americas, the future of this swampy colony would hang in the balance. France had claimed Louisiana, yes, but for how long? Chapter 3: Slavery, Sugar, and Survival. By the time Louisiana was finally taking root under French rule, it was already clear that survival in the colony demanded more than stubbornness and strategy. It demanded labor, backbreaking, relentless, and endless labor. And in the eyes of those who governed from across the ocean, there was only one solution: the importation of human beings in chains. The dream of a profitable Louisiana had long been haunted by failure. The early settlers struggled to grow enough food. The climate was unfamiliar, the soil unpredictable, and disease swept through camps and forts with terrifying speed. But when the planters began turning to crops that had proven lucrative elsewhere, sugar, rice, indigo, and later cotton, they realized they had something the world wanted. All they needed now was a way to harvest it. The transatlantic slave trade had already transformed the Caribbean into an engine of European wealth. The blueprint was there. Louisiana, with its swampy lowlands and access to major rivers, was perfectly suited to follow the same brutal logic. And so, ship by ship, enslaved Africans were brought to the colony. Torn from homelands that stretched from Senegal to Angola, they were forced into a new world that offered no mercy. The voyage alone was a horror. Packed into the hulls of slave ships, chained together in suffocating darkness, many died before ever seeing the Gulf Coast. Those who survived were auctioned like livestock in the squares of New Orleans or marched upriver to plantations where they would live, work, and die under the lash. Sugar was king, but it was a cruel king. The crop demanded constant attention. Planting, cutting, boiling, refining. Unlike cotton, sugar processing couldn't wait. Once the cane was cut, it had to be crushed and boiled quickly before it spoiled. The entire process required scorching heat, dangerous machinery, and round-the-clock labor. It was punishing, and it broke people. Mortality rates on sugar plantations were staggering. Enslaved workers were often worked to death and replaced with new shipments. There was no incentive for owners to protect life, only profit. In the rice fields, the conditions were no better. Slaves stood knee-deep in water under a baking sun, battling mosquitoes, parasites, and exhaustion. Every breath of air was a battle. Every hour survived was an act of resistance. Yet even under these inhuman conditions, enslaved people fought to preserve their humanity. They brought with them not only physical labor, but music, language, knowledge, and spiritual strength. From West Africa came techniques for rice cultivation, the rhythms that would echo into jazz, the herbal medicines that healed when doctors would not, the stories and songs that gave meaning to suffering. Communities formed in the margins. On Sunday gatherings, in nighttime dances, in whispered prayers. Voodoo and Catholicism blended, forming unique spiritual traditions that frightened white planters and comforted the enslaved. Families were built in defiance of a system designed to tear them apart. The act of survival itself became resistance. Still, brutality ruled. Laws were written to keep the enslaved in chains, laws that forbade literacy, restricted movement, and gave slave owners the right to kill with impunity. The Code Noir, first introduced by the French in 1724, was designed to control every aspect of black life in the colony. Though it technically offered limited protections, such as requiring religious instruction and prohibiting the torture of slaves, in practice, it was another tool of oppression. Enslaved people were property. They could be bought, sold, punished, or passed down like furniture. But Louisiana was never quite like the other southern colonies. Its French and Spanish heritage created a legal and cultural gray zone that allowed for something rare in other parts of America: a class of free people of color. Some were the children of white planters and enslaved women. Others had bought their freedom or inherited it. Over time, they formed a distinct community, many of them educated, landowning, and influential. In cities like New Orleans, free people of color could own businesses, property, and even slaves themselves. This complicated racial landscape made Louisiana unique, but it did not make it equal. Whiteness still reigned at the top, and blackness was still bound to chains. The existence of a small free black class did little to ease the daily horror faced by the hundreds of thousands trapped in slavery's grip. As the decades passed, the plantation economy grew. The Mississippi became a superhighway of commerce, with flatboats and steamboats carrying sugar, rice, and indigo down to the Gulf and beyond. Planters grew rich, cities expanded, but the wealth was built on bones. And then, as if the cruelty of the fields were not enough, natural disaster arrived. In 1780, a massive hurricane devastated southern Louisiana, destroying homes and plantations, killing thousands. Disease followed, as it always did. Yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox took more lives than war. The enslaved died in droves, but they were replaced over and over again. Through it all, Louisiana began to take shape not just as a colony or a port, but as a society forged in fire, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and divided by deep, violent lines. Sugar had made the land rich, slavery had made sugar possible, and that legacy would not be easily erased. By the turn of the century, Louisiana had become a central node in the global economy of suffering. The creaking of slave ships, the crack of the overseer's whip, the hum of the boiling house, all became the soundtrack of a land trying to transform swamp into empire. Yet beneath it all, the enslaved carried something that could not be broken: memory of freedom, of family, of the lands they came from and the names they had lost. In secret songs and coded stories, they preserved the pieces of themselves that the chains could not reach. They survived, not because the system allowed it, but because they refused to disappear. And so, as Louisiana grew in wealth and power, it also grew in shame. The sugar fields bore fruit, but they also bore witness. Every grain of sweetness came at a cost measured in blood and breath. And the story of that cost, of the men, women, and children who endured, would become one of the deepest roots of Louisiana's identity. Chapter 4: Spanish Louisiana. For most Americans, the story of Louisiana swings between the fleur-de-lis and the stars and stripes, from French colony to American state. But between those two flags fluttered another, often overlooked yet quietly transformative: the red and gold banner of Spain. It was during this forgotten chapter, from 1763 to 1800, that Louisiana was ruled not by French governors or American presidents, but by Spanish kings. And though Spain's grip on the colony was firm, its influence would linger long after the flag came down. The transfer came not through conquest, but through diplomacy, a deal made in the shadows of war. In 1762, as the 7 Years' War raged across continents, France found itself losing ground and leverage. Desperate to prevent Britain from claiming all its North American territories, France made a secret deal with Spain. In exchange for military support, it would hand over the vast Louisiana territory. When the war officially ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, the map of the continent had been redrawn. France lost Canada to Britain and ceded Louisiana to Spain. The French colonists in Louisiana, who had never been asked, woke up one day to find themselves subjects of a distant Spanish crown. They were not happy. Spanish Louisiana began with tension, confusion, and cultural friction. The colonists, fiercely proud of their French identity, saw the Spanish as foreign overlords. They didn't speak the language. They didn't follow Spanish customs. They had no interest in loyalty to Madrid. When Spain's first appointed governor, Antonio de Ulloa, arrived in 1766, he was met not with celebration, but with suspicion. Ulloa, a scientist more than a soldier, governed cautiously and largely behind the scenes. He tried to introduce Spanish trade laws, limit French influence, and curb smuggling. The colonists, particularly the merchants of New Orleans, saw these moves as threats to their livelihood and freedom. By 1768, the resentment boiled over. A group of Louisiana's French elites, planters, traders, and militia leaders, organized a rebellion. They expelled Ulloa and essentially declared that Louisiana had no king but the French one, even though France had already abandoned them. It was a bold move, and it would not go unpunished. Spain responded the way empires do, with force. In 1769, Alejandro O'Reilly, an Irish-born Spanish general, arrived in New Orleans with thousands of troops and a mandate to restore order. He did more than that. O'Reilly tried and executed the rebellion's leaders, earning the nickname Bloody O'Reilly, and then set about restructuring Louisiana in Spain's image. He formalized the colony's governance, reorganized the militia, introduced Spanish law, and made sure the colonists understood one thing above all: Spanish rule was not optional. And yet, after the crack of rebellion was silenced, something surprising happened. Spanish rule began to work. O'Reilly's successors, particularly Governor Luis de Unzaga and later the charismatic and pragmatic Bernardo de Galvez, oversaw a period of relative stability and growth. They didn't erase French culture, they accommodated it. French remained the language of everyday life. Catholicism stayed dominant, and many officials, especially those born in Louisiana, continued to act more like Frenchmen than Spaniards. Spain ruled with a light but steady hand. Under Spanish administration, the colony began to thrive in ways it hadn't before. Trade opened with Cuba and Mexico. Smuggling was tolerated so long as it didn't threaten the crown. Land grants encouraged settlement in the interior. Spanish engineers improved infrastructure, and legal reform strengthened protections for enslaved people, including provisions for manumission, the right to purchase one's freedom. While slavery remained foundational and cruel, the Spanish legal code offered pathways, however narrow, for mobility. A growing class of free people of color emerged during this era, many of them literate, skilled, and landowning. Then came the war that would give Spain a chance to prove its loyalty to the American cause. During the American Revolution, Spain declared war on Britain and joined France in aiding the rebels. Governor Bernardo de Galvez led military campaigns that captured British outposts along the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast, including Baton Rouge and Pensacola. His victories helped secure the southern flank of the colonies and contributed to the eventual American triumph. Galvez became a hero, not just to Spain, but later to the young United States. His name still lives on in the Louisiana town of Galvez and a statue in Washington, D.C. Despite these successes, Spanish Louisiana remained a world of contradictions. It was a colony governed by Spanish law, spoken in French, inhabited by Africans, Europeans, and native peoples, and shaped by Caribbean trade. The architecture of New Orleans transformed during this period, especially after two devastating fires in 1788 and 1794, wiped out much of the city. Spanish officials ordered the city rebuilt with brick and tile roofs to prevent future disasters. The result was a new look: arched windows, courtyards, wrought iron balconies that would become iconic. The famous French Quarter, paradoxically, owes much of its visual character to Spanish design. Religious life continued under the watchful eye of the Catholic Church. Spanish priests took over from the French, and churches were rebuilt in the new style. Meanwhile, education slowly expanded, with religious orders teaching both white and free black children. Still, life remained brutally unequal. Enslaved Africans worked the sugar plantations. Native nations were pushed further west. And while laws might promise rights, the whip still ruled in the cane fields. By the 1790s, the world was changing again. Revolution rocked France. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. The Haitian Revolution exploded just across the water, sending thousands of white planters and free people of color fleeing from the island of Saint-Domingue to Louisiana. They brought money, skills, and, critically, reinforced the unique Creole culture already taking shape in New Orleans. The city, already a blend of France, Spain, and Africa, became even more of a melting pot. Spain, meanwhile, was losing its grip. Weakened by war, distracted by rebellion, and anxious about Napoleon's growing influence, Spanish officials began to question whether Louisiana was worth the trouble. It was too French to control, too American to keep, and too remote to truly matter in the new European order. In 1800, under pressure from Napoleon, Spain quietly handed Louisiana back to France in the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso. For a brief moment, France once again ruled the colony, at least on paper. But Napoleon had no interest in holding on to a territory he could not defend. Just 3 years later, he would sell it to the United States in a deal that would double the size of the young nation. But by then, the Spanish legacy was already woven into the land. In its laws, its architecture, its names, and its people, Spanish Louisiana had left a mark that could not be erased. It was an era born of imperial chess, rebellion, and reform, an era so often forgotten, yet so deeply foundational to what Louisiana would become. Chapter 5. Creole Culture. By the time the Spanish handed Louisiana back to the French at the turn of the 19th century, the land had become something neither empire fully understood. It had begun as a French colony, passed through the hands of Spanish governors, and absorbed wave after wave of settlers, soldiers, slaves, and survivors. But what emerged from that churning mix of languages, laws, and lives was not merely a European transplant or a colonial imitation. It was something entirely original, a culture born in the heat and humidity of a land that refused to be tamed. A culture called Creole. In Louisiana, the word Creole did not mean what it meant elsewhere. It did not simply describe people of mixed descent, nor was it limited to one race, language, or class. It was a word that contained multitudes, and it changed shape depending on who said it and when. For some, it referred to anyone born in the colony rather than in Europe. For others, it meant a person of French or Spanish heritage born in the New World. For many, it meant the children of European fathers and African mothers, free or enslaved, rich or poor, Catholic or spiritual. It was not a box. It was a spectrum. And nowhere did that spectrum shine more vividly than in New Orleans. The city had always been a place of convergence. Founded by the French, governed by the Spanish, defended by Africans, and built in part by Caribbean refugees, it became a crossroads where cultures didn't just collide, they combined. Language was the first signal. On any given street, one might hear French, Spanish, African tongues like Wolof or Kikongo, Caribbean Creoles, and eventually English, all blending into a local patois that was as unpredictable as it was expressive. It wasn't just multilingual, it was polyphonic. Religion, too, revealed the layers. Catholicism remained the official faith, and churches anchored every community, from grand cathedrals to humble chapels. But beneath the Latin prayers and golden altars, other traditions pulsed. West African spiritual practices, carried across oceans by enslaved people, survived in secrecy and evolved under pressure. Blended with Catholic saints, local herbs, and ancestral rites, these traditions gave birth to something uniquely Louisianan, a spiritual worldview that saw no contradiction in lighting a candle to St. Peter and offering rum to an ancestral spirit on the same day. Voodoo was not a caricature here. It was memory, medicine, resistance. Music was another meeting ground. The rhythms of West Africa met the melodies of Europe in a place where neither side dominated. The enslaved brought drums and call and response chants. The French brought violins and chansons. The Spanish added guitar and syncopation. And every Sunday, in a dusty square known as Congo Square, enslaved and free people of color gathered to dance, sing, and remember. It was not just entertainment, it was survival. It was in these gatherings that the seeds of jazz were planted, though no one could have known it then. Creole cuisine also spoke to the region's blended soul. French techniques met African spices. Spanish rice met native beans. The okra stew called gumbo simmered with influences from every direction. Crawfish etouffee, jambalaya, red beans and rice. Each dish was a map of the past, eaten with the hands of the present. Food was more than sustenance, it was storytelling. But beyond language, religion, music, and food, Creole culture was defined by its people. The free people of color who walked the uneasy line between freedom and oppression. In no other part of the American South did such a large, prosperous, and complex community of mixed-race individuals thrive with such visibility. Many were descendants of African women and European men. Some had bought their freedom or inherited it. Others were artisans, teachers, musicians, and merchants. They owned property. They wore fine clothes. They attended balls and sent their children to school in Paris. In this liminal space, a world of astonishing creativity and resilience flourished. But it was always fragile. The lines of race and class in Louisiana were porous, but they were not absent. A person might be free, educated, wealthy, and still be denied the rights given to even the poorest white man. As the 19th century progressed, those lines would harden. But during this moment, in the space between empires, Creole culture carved out room to breathe. Architecture reflected this duality. The grand townhouses of the French Quarter, with their wrought iron balconies and hidden courtyards, were built during the Spanish era but housed French families and African servants. Shotgun houses lined the streets in working-class neighborhoods, influenced by Caribbean designs. Buildings were functional but elegant, shaded but open, solid yet inviting, designed for the climate and the community. Even death was Creole. The city's famous above-ground cemeteries, born from the soggy soil and Catholic tradition, became cities of the dead. Tombs were shared by generations, their names carved into stone in French, Spanish, and later English. Voodoo priestesses, wealthy merchants, and musicians rested side by side beneath marble crosses and iron gates. In life and death, Louisiana belonged to no single story. What made Creole culture so powerful was not its clarity, but its contradiction. It defied the rigid categories that shaped most of early America. It was French, but not France. African, but not Africa. Spanish, but not Spain. American, but not quite yet. It was born of empire, but belonged to no empire. It was local, stubborn, and alive. This world, possible to replicate and easy to misunderstand, gave Louisiana its voice. A voice shaped not by purity, but by blend, not by conquest, but by survival. In the songs sung on porches, in the spices stirred into a pot, in the prayers whispered in 2 languages to 3 gods, Creole culture breathed. And while it was often marginalized, often exoticized, often dismissed as folklore or novelty, it was in fact foundational. Creole culture was not an ornament. It was the skeleton of Louisiana's identity. It gave the region its rhythms, its accents, its paradoxes. As the 19th century dawned and new powers prepared to claim the land, what they found in Louisiana was not an empty space to be molded, but a living culture that refused to fit their molds. Creole Louisiana, forged in fire, song, and survival, stood ready to meet the next flag with the same resolve it had shown all the others. It would bend, but it would never break. Chapter 6. The Louisiana Purchase. By the dawn of the 19th century, Louisiana stood as a cultural mosaic, a land unlike any other in the Americas. It had been French, then Spanish, then briefly French again, but never truly American. Not yet. Its people spoke different tongues, worshipped in varied ways, and lived by customs that defied simple categorization. And yet, all of it, the cities, the swamps, the rivers, the vast, wild plains beyond, was about to change hands once more. But this time, it wouldn't be an empire on the other side of the Atlantic claiming the territory. It would be a young, restless republic called the United States of America. And the deal that brought Louisiana into the American fold would become the most famous real estate transaction in world history. In 1800, under pressure from Napoleon Bonaparte, Spain secretly agreed to return Louisiana to France through the Treaty of San Ildefonso. It was a quiet shift. Spain continued administering the colony for several more years, and few people in the territory noticed a difference. But in Paris, the wheels were already turning. Napoleon had visions of a renewed French empire in the Americas. He dreamed of colonies stretching from the Caribbean to the Mississippi, anchored by the wealth of sugar and secured by French soldiers. Louisiana was to be the keystone in this arch. But dreams, like empires, can fall apart faster than they're built. Napoleon's plans hinged on maintaining control of the island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, France's richest colony, thanks to its brutal sugar plantations. But in 1791, the enslaved population there had risen up in one of the most powerful and successful slave revolutions in history. Led by men like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the revolutionaries shattered the French hold on the island. By the time Napoleon sent troops to reclaim it, yellow fever and fierce resistance had decimated his forces. France lost Saint-Domingue, and with it, its appetite for empire in the Americas. At the same time, trouble was brewing on the other side of the Atlantic. In the United States, President Thomas Jefferson was watching developments in Louisiana with increasing concern. For years, American settlers moving westward had relied on access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to transport their goods. The river was the artery of trade for the interior states. But now, with France poised to retake control of New Orleans, Jefferson feared that this lifeline could be cut off, or worse, controlled by an unpredictable European power. Jefferson, a man of Enlightenment ideals and agrarian dreams, believed deeply in the promise of westward expansion. He envisioned a nation of independent farmers stretching from sea to shining sea. But that dream required land, lots of land. And land in those days meant diplomacy or war. Determined to secure American access to the Mississippi, Jefferson sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France in 1803 with a simple mission: negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and the surrounding area. Their budget was $10 million. They hoped, perhaps optimistically, that Napoleon might agree to sell the city, or at least grant permanent American access to the port. But when the Americans arrived in Paris, they found a very different situation waiting for them. Napoleon, bruised by the failure in Saint-Domingue and facing the looming prospect of war with Britain, had changed his calculus. Without the Caribbean, Louisiana was no longer an asset. It was a liability. He didn't want to defend it, he didn't want to supply it, and he certainly didn't want it to fall into British hands. If he could sell it, and quickly, he could fund his European campaigns and offload the burden of a distant colony. So, instead of selling just New Orleans, Napoleon made a stunning offer. The entire Louisiana territory. All of it. From the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. From the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. More than 800,000 square miles of land for $15 million. The Americans were stunned. It was far more than they had been authorized to buy, and far more land than they knew what to do with. But it was too good to pass up. Without even waiting for instructions from Jefferson, they agreed. In one stroke, the size of the United States doubled. Back in Washington, Jefferson faced a dilemma. He was a strict constitutionalist, a man who believed the federal government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. Now he found himself the proud new owner of a massive foreign territory, with no constitutional provision for such a purchase. But principles tend to bend in the face of opportunity. Jefferson justified the acquisition as a treaty, which fell within presidential powers. The Senate ratified the agreement, and just like that, the Louisiana Purchase became law. Yet while politicians toasted and maps were redrawn, the people of Louisiana were left in confusion. Few of them had ever asked to become Americans. They spoke French or Spanish, practiced Catholicism, and lived according to customs that had little in common with the Protestant, English-speaking settlers streaming westward. The transition to American rule was anything but smooth. New laws clashed with old traditions. Property rights, legal systems, and even language policies were all thrown into question. Many in Louisiana viewed the Americans as invaders, not liberators. Still, the tide had turned. The stars and stripes were raised. American officials arrived. And slowly, the long process of incorporation began. The Louisiana Territory, vast and unexplored, became the great canvas of American expansion. It opened the door for Lewis and Clark's expedition, for waves of settlers, for railroads, for boom towns and bloodshed. It would also bring conflict over land, over native rights, over slavery. But all of that was yet to come. In 1803, the deal stood as a symbol of ambition, $15 million for a continent's worth of promise. It was a bargain, a risk, and a beginning. And while France faded from the Mississippi, its influence remained. In the churches and kitchens, in the sounds of the street and the structure of the law, the old world refused to vanish. Louisiana would become American, but it would never become just American. It would carry with it the echoes of every flag it had flown, every language spoken on its soil, every soul who had claimed it as home. Chapter 7. Territory to Statehood. When the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the United States had acquired more than just land. It had inherited a cultural puzzle. The territory was enormous, spanning prairies, rivers, forests, and mountains. But it was the dense, sultry corner at its southern edge that caused the most immediate trouble. That corner was the original colony of Louisiana, a world unto itself, already teeming with people who did not think of themselves as American, at least not yet. The Americans arrived with stars in their eyes and laws in their briefcases. They came to bring democracy, capitalism, and order. But what they found was a place where French was spoken on the street. Catholicism ruled the soul, civil law guided the courts, and Creole customs shaped everyday life. The people of Louisiana had lived under two European empires and had adapted to each one in their own way. But the Americans were different. They didn't just bring a new flag, they brought a new identity, one that demanded assimilation. The earliest years of American control were marked by tension and suspicion. Military rule was imposed, and new administrators were sent in to govern a population that didn't trust them, couldn't understand them, and often didn't want them there. William C. Claiborne, the first American governor, struggled to assert authority. He didn't speak French or Spanish. He didn't understand the Creole elite. And he quickly realized that governance in Louisiana required more than American ideals. It required negotiation. Language became one of the first battlegrounds. The Americans insisted that English be the official language of government and education. But Louisiana was overwhelmingly French-speaking. In courtrooms, churches, marketplaces, and homes, French was the language of life. Laws printed in English were ignored. Official proclamations went unread. And when the Americans attempted to create English-language schools, they found few students and fewer willing teachers. Religion was another point of conflict. The United States, founded in part by Protestant dissenters, had no official religion and carried a suspicion of Catholic power. Louisiana, by contrast, had been Catholic for generations. Churches were not just houses of worship. They were centers of community, of identity, of tradition. The arrival of Protestant missionaries was met with cool resistance, and while the Americans tolerated Catholicism, they did not embrace it. For many Louisianans, this felt like cultural erasure masquerading as progress. Then came the law. Under both French and Spanish rule, Louisiana had operated under a civil law system, a code-based legal tradition that prioritized written statutes over case law. But the United States followed common law, rooted in British precedent and courtroom decisions. The clash was immediate and confusing. Property rights, inheritance, contracts, all were governed by different rules. The Americans pushed for a transition to common law. The Louisianans pushed back. In time, a compromise emerged. Louisiana would keep its civil law tradition, becoming the only state in the Union to operate under such a system. But the scars of that legal conflict lingered. Amid these cultural battles, the question of political power loomed large. Louisiana's elite, largely Creole, Catholic, and French-speaking, feared losing control to the flood of English-speaking settlers moving in from Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond. These new Americans brought their own ideas about land, liberty, and race. They were often Protestant, often slaveholding, and often impatient with the old ways of the colony. They wanted Louisiana to become more like them. The Creoles, in turn, feared being ruled by men who neither respected their heritage nor understood their world. Still, statehood beckoned. By 1804, the territory of Orleans had been carved out of the larger Louisiana Purchase, marking the beginning of a new political era. But the path to full statehood was not smooth. The U.S. Congress debated whether this foreign land, with its strange laws, its foreign language, and its mixed population, could truly become part of the American experiment. Some feared that granting statehood would dilute the values of the Republic. Others believed the territory needed more time to Americanize. Louisianans, however, had no intention of waiting quietly. They wanted representation. They wanted sovereignty. and they wanted to shape their own future. A constitutional convention was called, and in 1812, Louisiana formally entered the Union as the 18th state. The name was kept, though it now referred only to the southernmost portion of the old French territory. The rest would become new territories, new states, new questions. But statehood didn't settle the cultural tension. It only sharpened it. In the new state legislature, Creoles and Americans jostled for control. Elections were heated, and politics quickly grew personal. The state's capital moved frequently, bouncing between New Orleans, Donaldsonville, and Baton Rouge as factions fought for influence. Newspapers proliferated, some in English, some in French, each accusing the other side of corruption, ignorance, or worse. It was politics as culture war, long before the term existed. Meanwhile, the population of Louisiana was shifting. More Anglo-Americans arrived, settling upriver and across the interior. Free people of color, once a vital part of urban life, found themselves increasingly marginalized by new racial codes brought from the American South. The racial hierarchy hardened. Where once there had been some fluidity, now there was law. One drop of African ancestry was enough to strip a person of rights. The American obsession with binary race classifications began to overwrite the older, more complex social orders. Yet through it all, Louisiana remained defiantly itself. New Orleans thrived as a port, as a cultural hub, and as a place where the old world and the new world danced in the same streets. The city grew in wealth, population, and reputation. It became a place where jazz would be born, where cuisine would become legend, where architecture whispered of empire and rebellion. And while the state was now undeniably American in law and politics, it remained unmistakably Louisianan in spirit. The struggle to become part of the Union had been real, and it had left deep grooves in the landscape of identity. Louisiana didn't simply join the United States. It challenged it. It forced the nation to consider what it meant to be American when the citizens spoke another language, followed different gods, and held on to a past that didn't quite fit the national myth. In the end, Louisiana entered the Union not as a blank canvas, but as a finished painting the Americans had to learn to frame. And though the stars on the flag now included Louisiana, the story beneath that flag remained singular. A state born of collision, not conformity. A place where the question wasn't whether Louisiana would become American, but whether America could become big enough to include Louisiana. Chapter 8. War, Cotton, and Secession. Statehood had brought Louisiana into the Union, but it had not erased its complexities. In the decades that followed, the state found itself swept up in the national tide. Its culture still unique, but its economy increasingly, beating to the same rhythm as the rest of the American South. That rhythm was set by cotton. And cotton, more than any speech or law or battle, would pull Louisiana down the long, bloody road to secession and war. The rise of cotton was not immediate. In the colonial days, sugar had been king along the river parishes. Indigo and rice had also played their parts. But by the 1820s and 1830s, cotton was emerging as the crop that would define not just the South, but an entire American century. It was soft, profitable, and increasingly essential to the mills of England and the looms of New England. And Louisiana, with its fertile delta lands and access to the Mississippi River, was perfectly positioned to become one of its leading producers. Plantations multiplied across the state, especially in the northern and central regions where the land was high enough for large-scale cotton farming. Each plantation was a world unto itself, a sprawling estate powered by the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. The cotton economy was brutal and efficient. Slaves worked from sunup to sundown, bent at the waist, picking cotton bolls in the summer heat. They were whipped for working too slowly. They were sold if they aged. They were counted as property and insured like livestock. Their lives fueled the profits of men who built grand mansions, sent their sons to Yale, and held court in the drawing rooms of New Orleans. By 1860, Louisiana had more than 330,000 enslaved people, almost half the state's total population. In some parishes, they outnumbered whites 2-to-1. And while the sugar plantations of the South continued to thrive, it was cotton that pushed the economy ever forward. The wealth generated by slavery flowed directly into the streets of New Orleans. The Crescent City became the jewel of the South. It was one of the largest cities in America, a bustling cosmopolitan hub where fortunes were made and lost overnight. Its port, situated near the mouth of the Mississippi, became the central artery for trade in the Western world. Bales of cotton were loaded by the thousands, destined for Liverpool and Boston. Slave markets flourished in public squares and private auction houses, where families were torn apart with the strike of a gavel. Steamboats arrived daily, loaded with goods, gossip, and gamblers. Wealthy planters built townhouses along St. Charles Avenue, while Creole elites still held court in the French Quarter. But beneath the wealth and bustle, Louisiana simmered with contradictions. The population was deeply divided, not just between enslaved and free, but also between Creoles and Anglo-Americans, Catholics and Protestants, French-speaking and English-speaking citizens. Tensions flared over language, education, race, and class. Free people of color, many of whom owned property and businesses, found their rights increasingly under attack as new laws narrowed the definition of freedom. Slavery had hardened society, and in doing so, it had narrowed the space for those who lived between the lines. Nationally, the question of slavery was turning from a debate into a reckoning. The Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each legislative battle only deepened the divide between North and South. The abolitionist movement gained strength. The Underground Railroad helped more enslaved people escape. And every new state added to the Union brought a fresh argument: slave or free. In Louisiana, most of the political class was firmly pro-slavery. For them, slavery was not just an economic necessity, it was a way of life, a pillar of identity. They feared abolition not only because it threatened their wealth, but because it threatened their worldview. Slavery, they argued, was sanctioned by God, protected by the Constitution, and essential to civilization. To end it would be to destroy the South. Secession had been whispered about for years. It flared up after the Compromise of 1850, again after the Dred Scott decision, and with full volume during the election of 1860. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on an anti-slavery platform, despite not carrying a single Southern state. Louisiana's leaders saw the writing on the wall. Lincoln, they believed, would destroy their way of life. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. His election was the final confirmation that the South no longer had a future inside the Union. One by one, Southern states began to secede. South Carolina was the first, followed quickly by Mississippi and Florida. On January 26, 1861, Louisiana joined them. The vote for secession passed with strong support from the planter class and political elites, though not all Louisianans agreed. In New Orleans, many merchants feared economic collapse. In the northern hill country, small farmers who owned no slaves saw no reason to fight a war for the rich. But the vote carried, and the state declared itself a sovereign entity, no longer part of the United States. In the months that followed, Confederate flags flew over courthouses. Militias drilled in town squares. Young men enlisted with dreams of glory and defensive honor. New Orleans, vital to the Confederacy's logistics and commerce, prepared for war. The state's future now depended on the outcome of a conflict it had helped ignite. But even in those early days of secession, the ground beneath Louisiana was shifting. The same river that had made the state rich now became a strategic target. The same city that had symbolized its prosperity would soon become a battlefield. And the system of slavery that had built its wealth would not survive the storm that was coming. What had begun as a French experiment, grown into a Spanish province, and flowered into a Creole paradise, was now marching toward civil war, not as a bystander, but as one of its central players. Cotton had brought fortune. Slavery had built an empire, but both had also sown the seeds of rupture. And Louisiana, caught in the tide of history, was about to pay the price. Chapter 9. Civil War and Union Occupation. When Louisiana seceded from the Union in early 1861, its leaders were defiant, its planters confident, and its cities buzzing with anticipation. The Southern cause felt righteous to those in power, an act of self-preservation wrapped in the language of liberty. There were parades, speeches, and songs. But war is not kind to romantic visions, and as the first year of the Civil War unfolded, Louisiana learned how quickly pride can crumble beneath the weight of cannon fire. At the heart of the state's strategic importance was New Orleans. It was the largest city in the Confederacy, the most vital port in the South, and the mouth of the Mississippi River. Control New Orleans, and you choked off Confederate supply lines. Lose it, and you lost more than cotton. You lost legitimacy, power, and access to the world. President Lincoln understood this. So did the Union Navy. In the spring of 1862, Union Admiral David Farragut led a daring naval assault up the Mississippi. On the night of April 24th, his fleet ran past the Confederate forts guarding the river, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, after days of bombardment. The defenders, under-resourced and outgunned, held out as long as they could, but they could not stop the advance. Within days, Union ships appeared in the harbor of New Orleans. The city, shocked and unprepared, surrendered without a single shot fired within its streets. Panic spread faster than orders. Confederate soldiers fled. Officials burned cotton, ships, and supplies to prevent them from falling into Union hands. Banks closed. Merchants froze. The flag of the Confederacy came down, and in its place, the stars and stripes rose again over the custom house. Just over a year after secession, New Orleans was under federal control. The occupation began under the command of Union General Benjamin Butler, a man whose name would come to be cursed and mocked in the South. To Union loyalists, Butler was firm and clever. To Confederates, he was a tyrant. His rule was marked by controversial orders and ruthless enforcement. He confiscated property from secessionists, enforced martial law, and publicly hanged a man for tearing down an American flag. But it was one order in particular, General Order Number 28, that made him infamous. In response to the women of New Orleans, many of whom spit at Union soldiers, dumped chamber pots from balconies, and refused even eye contact with the enemy, Butler issued a directive stating that any woman insulting a Union officer would be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. In other words, as a prostitute. The reaction was explosive. Outrage echoed across the South and into Europe. Southern newspapers labeled him Beast Butler, and his name became synonymous with Northern arrogance and cruelty. But beneath the public theater of occupation, life in New Orleans continued, albeit under new rules. The city's diverse population reacted in equally diverse ways. Wealthy white planters mourned their losses and stewed in resentment. Unionists, both native-born and Northern transplants, found new influence. Free people of color, long caught between privilege and prejudice, watched carefully to see whether the promises of the Union meant anything at all for them. And enslaved people, thousands of them, began to move. Some ran to Union lines, some stayed put but refused to obey. Some waited silently for a freedom they could feel pressing against the horizon. Butler, for all his bluster, took important steps toward emancipation. He employed formerly enslaved men in the Union Army. He opened schools for black children. He recognized the contributions of black soldiers and laborers, granting them a level of respect rare in that era. These decisions were not always born of moral clarity. Often they were strategic. But they carried real consequences. They signaled a shift. Meanwhile, the rest of Louisiana remained deeply divided. In the north and west of the state, Confederate sympathies ran strong. Guerrilla fighters harassed Union supply lines. Towns bristled with resistance. But even there, cracks were forming. Not all white Louisianans had supported secession to begin with. Many poor farmers resented the war, especially as the Confederate government began conscripting sons and seizing crops. The idea that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight gained traction. Inside the occupied zones, especially in the sugar parishes and along the river, emancipation began to unfold in slow, uneven waves. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, technically did not apply to areas under Union control, including New Orleans. But its moral and symbolic weight reached deep into Louisiana's soil. Slaves fled to freedom by the thousands, forming refugee camps, joining Union regiments, or setting up makeshift communities on abandoned plantations. Former masters found themselves powerless, confused, and often enraged. The social order was crumbling. Old rules no longer held. The courthouse spoke one language, the fields another. Black churches grew, white planters whispered of vengeance. Union officers tried to keep peace while administering a society undergoing seismic change. No one knew what Louisiana would look like when the war ended, but everyone sensed it would never return to what it had been. In the countryside, fighting intensified. The Red River Campaign of 1864 saw Union and Confederate forces clash in bloody skirmishes, with little strategic gain. The war, by then, had become a grinding, endless wait. Supplies were scarce, roads were dangerous, and the Confederacy was beginning to falter. But even as the military struggle wore on, the political transformation had begun. In 1864, with Union control solid in the south of the state, Louisiana held a constitutional convention. It abolished slavery, though not fully embracing racial equality. It created a new government loyal to the Union, even while much of the state remained under Confederate influence. Louisiana became an early experiment in Reconstruction before the war had even ended. It was a fractured, awkward, and uncertain beginning. By the time General Robert E. Lee surrendered in April 1865, Louisiana was a state of ruins and rebirth. Plantations lay abandoned, cities bore scars, families were torn apart, some by battle, others by emancipation. Yet within that chaos, something new had taken root. The Union flag still flew over New Orleans, not as a symbol of conquest, but of a new, fragile promise. The war had come and gone. The occupation had turned enemies into uneasy neighbors. And the enslaved, for centuries kept in bondage, were now free. Though what that freedom would mean was still an open question. Louisiana had entered the war defending slavery and the Southern way of life. It emerged from the war occupied, transformed, and forever altered. Chapter 10: Reconstruction and Resistance. When the Civil War ended, the guns fell silent, but the battle for Louisiana's soul had only just begun. In theory, the Confederacy was gone, slavery abolished, and the Union restored. In practice, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new kind of conflict, one not fought on battlefields, but in courtrooms, ballots, and back alleys. It was a war over what freedom would truly mean. And in Louisiana, the answers came slowly, violently, and at a cost that would echo for generations. At first, there was hope. With the Confederacy defeated and federal troops still present, the Reconstruction era promised not only physical rebuilding, but also a radical reimagining of society. For newly freed African Americans, the moment was electric. Families once separated by slavery reunited. Black churches, schools, and mutual aid societies sprang up across the state. Freedmen's conventions gathered to discuss voting rights, land ownership, and education. For the first time in Louisiana's history, Black voices were speaking openly in public and demanding a stake in the future. The federal government, under President Andrew Johnson and later Ulysses S. Grant, pushed for Southern states to accept new realities. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery, and the 14th and 15th Amendments followed, granting citizenship and voting rights to Black men. The Freedmen's Bureau opened offices in Louisiana to help formerly enslaved people adjust to freedom, offering food, legal help, and support for new schools. Radical Republicans in Congress aimed to enforce a vision of the South where equality under the law was more than a slogan. For a brief and extraordinary period, progress seemed possible. Black men voted in large numbers and were elected to public office. In Louisiana, more than 30 Black legislators served in the state assembly during the height of Reconstruction. Oscar Dunn, born into slavery in New Orleans, became the first Black lieutenant governor in U.S. history. Education expanded. Civil rights laws were passed. There was even talk of economic reform, including land redistribution. But freedom is never granted without opposition. The backlash came quickly, and it came hard. Many white Louisianans, especially former Confederates and wealthy planters, had never accepted defeat. They had tolerated Union occupation. They had watched Reconstruction unfold. But they had no intention of sharing power. To them, the presence of Black lawmakers in Baton Rouge and Black voters at the polls was nothing short of a nightmare. And so they fought back, not with armies, but with terror. Violence surged across the state. White supremacist groups formed in the shadows, the most notorious being the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. These organizations were not fringe. They were deeply embedded in communities, often including ex-Confederate officers, local sheriffs, and prominent citizens. Their mission was simple: to restore white dominance by any means necessary. Black voters were threatened, beaten, and killed. White Republicans were harassed and sometimes lynched. Elections were marred by fraud and intimidation. In rural parishes, entire black communities lived under siege. The violence wasn't random. It was strategic. Every beating sent a message. Every burned schoolhouse was a warning. Every murder was meant to say, "This is still our state." The bloodiest example came in 1873 in the small town of Colfax, Louisiana. There, a disputed local election between white Democrats and black Republicans turned deadly. Fearing that their newly elected officials would be overthrown, hundreds of black citizens fortified the local courthouse. A white militia responded with overwhelming force, attacking the building, setting it on fire, and killing over 100 black men, many after they had already surrendered. It was one of the worst racial massacres in American history, and the perpetrators faced almost no consequences. In the cities, the resistance took different forms: legal challenges, newspaper propaganda, and political maneuvering. Southern Democrats branded Reconstruction governments as corrupt, illegitimate, and controlled by Northern carpetbaggers and ignorant freedmen. They painted themselves as the true protectors of tradition and order. And in time, their message began to win support, not just in Louisiana, but in Washington. By the late 1870s, the North was growing weary of Reconstruction. The economic panic of 1873 had shifted attention to financial concerns. Political scandals in Washington damaged the Republican Party's moral authority. Many Northerners, never deeply committed to racial equality, began to embrace the idea of reconciliation with the South, even if that meant abandoning black citizens to their fate. In Louisiana, the collapse came slowly, then all at once. The 1876 gubernatorial election was a mess of fraud and violence. Both Republican and Democratic candidates claimed victory, each holding separate inaugurations. Federal troops were deployed to protect the Republican government, but it was a fragile arrangement. Then came the Compromise of 1877. In a backroom deal to resolve the contested presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for the presidency. With that, Reconstruction officially ended. In Louisiana, the impact was immediate. The Republican state government fell. Democrats seized control, backed by militias and mobs. Black legislators were expelled or pushed aside. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Segregation laws soon followed. And the terror continued, not as rebellion, but as policy. The promises of Reconstruction, so briefly real, faded like smoke. A new order took hold, one that would come to be known as Jim Crow. For black Louisianans, the years that followed were marked by disenfranchisement, poverty, and second-class citizenship. For white elites, the old hierarchy had been restored. The war had ended, slavery had ended, but white supremacy had survived. And yet, something had changed. The memory of Reconstruction, of black power, black office holders, and black communities standing together, did not disappear. It lived on in families, churches, and stories. It planted seeds that would one day bloom again in the long, painful struggle for civil rights. Louisiana had passed through fire, and the fire had not cleansed, it had scarred. Reconstruction had offered a glimpse of a different future, one built on equality and shared power. But the resistance had been stronger, and the backlash more enduring. What remained was a state deeply divided, where the law said one thing and the streets said another. And as Louisiana moved into the new century, its past would continue to haunt its present, reminding all who lived there that the struggle for freedom was never a single moment, but an endless fight against forgetting. Chapter 11: Jim Crow and the Lost Century. Reconstruction had ended not with a bang, but with a handshake. An agreement that pulled the last federal troops out of the South and left Louisiana in the hands of men who longed to turn back the clock. They could not bring back slavery, but they could rebuild its shadows. And so began the long era known as Jim Crow, a century not defined by outright war, but by a quiet, suffocating violence that touched every part of black life in Louisiana. The new order came dressed in legality. It didn't wear the robes of rebellion, but the cloak of reform. State legislatures rewrote constitutions. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses choked off the black vote. Entire generations of African Americans were pushed out of the political process, their voices silenced not by bayonets, but by bureaucracy. Segregation became the law of the land. On streetcars, in schools, at water fountains, in cemeteries. Signs that read, "Colored only" or "Whites only" became the background noise of daily life, as natural and as cruel as the humidity in July. But law was only part of it. Fear ruled too. Lynchings became public warnings. A whisper, an accusation, an imagined insult could bring a mob. In small towns and parishes across Louisiana, black men were dragged from homes and hanged from trees while their families watched. No one was punished. Local papers reported the deaths with thinly veiled approval. The message was clear. Freedom had limits, and those who tested them would be made examples. Still, black Louisianans endured. They endured because they had to, because there was no other choice. They built what they could in the margins they were given. Churches became sanctuaries, not only of faith, but of resistance. Ministers preached hope from pulpits lined with fans and hymnals, their voices rising above the heat and fear. Schools, underfunded and overcrowded, still educated generations of children who would one day demand more. Fraternal organizations, barbershops, beauty salons, and corner stores formed a parallel society, one that mirrored the white world, but belonged to the black community alone. And in the heart of New Orleans, something extraordinary was happening. From Congo Square to Basin Street, from the brothels of Storyville to the clubs of Treme, a sound was taking shape. It was a blend of brass bands and blues, of gospel and ragtime, of sorrow and swing. It didn't follow rules, it bent them. It didn't ask permission, it just played. This sound, born of pain and genius, would become America's greatest musical gift: jazz. In the early 1900s, jazz was still finding its name. But its spirit was already undeniable. Buddy Bolden blew his cornet loud enough to shake windows. Jelly Roll Morton called himself the inventor of the genre, stitching piano riffs with swagger and syncopation. And soon, a young man named Louis Armstrong would pick up a trumpet and carry the sound of New Orleans to the world. Jazz wasn't just music. It was freedom. In a society that tried to cage black expression, jazz broke free. It was improvisation in a world of rules, joy in a landscape of grief. And though white audiences and record companies would later try to package it, polish it, and profit from it, the soul of jazz remained rooted in black Louisiana. But even as the music soared, life remained harsh. The sharecropping system replaced slavery with a different kind of bondage. Black farmers, working the same land their ancestors had toiled, found themselves trapped by debt, cheated by merchants, and bound to contracts they couldn't read and couldn't escape. The land was theirs in blood, but never on paper. Jobs in the cities offered little better. Domestic work, manual labor, port jobs. They paid just enough to survive, never enough to advance. And always, there was the constant risk of humiliation, of saying the wrong thing, looking the wrong way, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So many chose to leave. Beginning in the 1910s and continuing through the 1940s, waves of black Louisianans joined the Great Migration, heading north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. They rode trains with cardboard suitcases, packed into cars with relatives, chasing rumors of factory jobs and freedom. They left behind the bayous and parishes of their youth, hoping to find a better life far from Jim Crow's reach. But migration didn't mean forgetting. The culture of Louisiana traveled with them, in accents and recipes, in church songs and childhood stories, in music that carried the rhythm of the Delta into every northern jazz club. And many never left at all. They stayed, raised children, taught them how to survive, and waited for a future that seemed always just out of reach. Meanwhile, the white world moved on. Politicians in Baton Rouge passed laws to strengthen segregation. Universities remained closed to black students. New highways bulldozed through black neighborhoods in the name of progress. The state expanded, modernized, built bridges and levees, but left whole communities behind. And yet, through it all, black Louisiana resisted, not always in marches or speeches, but in everyday acts of defiance, in teaching a child to read, in dressing with dignity, in voting when possible, despite the obstacles, in making art that spoke truth, in simply staying alive in a system designed to erase you. By the middle of the 20th century, the cracks in Jim Crow were beginning to show. A new generation was coming of age, one raised on the stories of their grandparents, but unwilling to live by the same rules. They would soon demand more, march louder, and challenge the power structures that had stood for too long. But their struggle would rest on the shoulders of those who had already fought in quieter ways. Jim Crow was a system of laws, but also a way of seeing the world. It told some they were superior, and others that they should be invisible. It lasted not just because of violence, but because of silence. But the silence was ending. And in Louisiana, as in much of the South, a new reckoning was on the horizon. For nearly 100 years, the promise of Reconstruction had been buried beneath the weight of segregation, poverty, and terror. But it had not been forgotten. The people who had survived this lost century had carried the embers forward. And soon, those embers would catch fire. Chapter 12. Oil Industry and the 20th Century Boom. As the shadows of Jim Crow stretched across Louisiana, another force was reshaping the state. Not in courtrooms or classrooms, but deep underground. It started with a shimmer, a thick black fluid seeping up through swampy soil. Oil. The old economy of cotton and sugar had run its course. Something more volatile, more lucrative, and more transformative was rising. And with it, Louisiana began to change again. Not culturally this time, but chemically, structurally, and economically. The first big discovery came in 1901 near Jennings, a sleepy town in southwest Louisiana. Drillers, fueled by dreams of Texas-style gushers, struck black gold at a depth of over 1,000 feet. It wasn't the first well in the South, but it was the beginning of something massive. Oil fever spread like wildfire. Prospectors swarmed the region. Fields once planted with rice and cane now bristled with derricks. Money followed. Roads were paved. Towns expanded. Jennings, Lake Charles, and Lafayette would never be the same. From the marshlands to the prairies, oil rigs began to dot the horizon. Some boomed and busted within months. Others tapped into vast underground reserves that would feed pipelines and refineries for decades. By the 1920s and 30s, oil was no longer just a resource. It was an identity. Louisiana had become an energy state. But the real transformation came after World War II. The war had primed the engines of industry. When peace returned, the machinery didn't stop. It shifted. Refineries popped up along the Mississippi River corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, an area that would become known as Cancer Alley, due to the pollution and health impacts that followed. Chemical plants churned out synthetic rubber, plastic, and fertilizer. Companies like Exxon, Shell, and Dow established massive operations. Baton Rouge became home to one of the largest oil refineries in the country. The petrochemical age had arrived. These industries brought jobs, thousands of them. Skilled and unskilled laborers alike found work in plants that ran day and night. Unions fought for wages and safety. High school graduates could earn a solid living without ever leaving their hometowns. Entire families built lives around the shift whistle and the smell of sulfur in the air. Suburbs grew, schools expanded, and consumer culture spread through department stores, diners, and drive-ins. It was the American dream, wrapped in oil-soaked denim and factory smoke. Infrastructure followed the boom. Highways sliced across the state, linking once isolated communities to growing urban centers. The old rhythm of steamboats and ferries gave way to bridges and asphalt. U.S. Route 90 and Interstate 10 cut east to west, while Interstate 49 connected the oil towns of the interior. The automobile became king. Train depots emptied. Small-town main streets began to fade as chain stores and gas stations sprouted along the highways. Levees, too, were expanded and fortified. Louisiana's eternal struggle with water had always demanded attention. But now the stakes were higher. The Mississippi River, vital to industry and commerce, was increasingly confined by a growing system of levees, spillways, and control structures. The Army Corps of Engineers played a central role, reshaping the land with maps and machines. Nature was bent to economic will, or so it seemed. But not everyone shared in the boom. As industry clustered along the river and coast, much of rural Louisiana, especially in the north and along the bayous, was left behind. Mechanization had already hollowed out agriculture. Now, oil and chemicals were bypassing the old order entirely. Small towns lost population. Local businesses shuttered. Schools declined. The young left for cities. The elderly stayed behind. Places that had once buzzed with trains and cotton gins grew quiet, then disappeared from maps. Even in the boom towns, the benefits were uneven. Environmental degradation often fell hardest on poor and black communities. The same plants that provided jobs also polluted air and water. Regulation was weak. Oversight was often friendly to industry. Promises of economic prosperity came at the price of chronic illness, contaminated soil, and long-term ecological damage. Still, Louisiana adapted. Always had. Always would. Culture evolved alongside industry. Cajun and Creole communities, once viewed as relics of the past, began to embrace and promote their heritage. Zydeco and swamp pop filled dance halls on Friday nights. Festivals celebrated food, music, and memory. Oil money flowed into tourism campaigns, Mardi Gras celebrations, and state pride. The contradictions deepened. Industrial might and cultural resilience coexisted in strange harmony. politics shifted too. For much of the 20th century, Louisiana was dominated by populist figures who spoke to the working class while cutting deals with business elites. None loomed larger than Huey P. Long, the kingfish, who rose to power during the Great Depression with promises to share the wealth. He built roads, hospitals, and schools. He fought corporate monopolies while navigating his own. Long was assassinated in 1935, but his legacy shaped Louisiana's political identity for decades. Equal parts populism, patronage, and spectacle. By the 1970s, cracks were forming in the industrial dream. Oil prices swung wildly. Automation reduced the workforce. Globalization shifted manufacturing overseas. The same industries that had built modern Louisiana began to shrink, consolidate, or relocate. Communities built around single employers found themselves adrift. And as storms grew stronger and sea levels inched higher, the wisdom of draining wetlands and damming rivers came into question. Yet the 20th century had changed Louisiana forever. It was no longer just a place of cotton, jazz, and gumbo. It was a center of energy, engineering, and chemical production. Its economy had modernized. Its skyline had shifted. Its roads, pipes, and power lines stretched further than anyone in Jennings could have imagined back in 1901. Still, something had been lost. Small towns faded like photographs in the sun. Oral traditions frayed. Bayous turned brown. The land, once wild and unpredictable, had been tamed. And in many places, it had grown quiet. But Louisiana never forgets where it came from. Beneath the refineries and levees, beneath the steel and concrete, the old rhythms still lingered. In the drawl of a waitress, in the stomp of a fiddle, in the scent of boudin at a roadside stop. The oil may have brought the future, but the past remained close behind. Chapter 13. Civil Rights and Cultural Power. As the 20th century moved forward, the oil rigs and chemical plants continued to hum, but another force was rising in Louisiana. A force older than industry, deeper than politics, and louder than any machine. It came from voices long silenced, from melodies passed down through generations, and from the streets where people refused to stay quiet. Louisiana, once defined by its contradictions, was now becoming a stage. And the spotlight, at last, was finding its way to the margins. The struggle for civil rights in Louisiana didn't begin in the 1950s. It had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer be sustained. In 1896, long before sit-ins and marches, a man named Homer Plessy took a seat in a whites-only train car in New Orleans, refused to move, and was arrested. His case would go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the justices ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was constitutional. It was a devastating blow, one that legitimized segregation for over half a century. But the act of resistance itself became part of the state's legacy, a seed that would grow in time. By the 1950s and 60s, that seed had broken through the concrete. The national civil rights movement surged through Louisiana like a second river. The battles were local and specific, but the stakes were national. In Baton Rouge, a bus boycott in 1953, 2 years before Rosa Parks, was one of the first of its kind. Led by Reverend T.J. Jemison, the boycott showed the power of black churches, the possibility of collective action, and the pressure that could be placed on a segregated system when people refused to cooperate. In New Orleans, the fight centered on education. In 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges became the first black child to desegregate an all-white elementary school in the Deep South. Her walk into William Frantz Elementary, escorted by federal marshals and flanked by jeering crowds, was captured in newspapers across the world. She walked alone, day after day, into an empty classroom as white parents pulled their children out in protest. But she kept walking. Her image, small, brave, determined, became an icon of the era, a reminder that change often begins with a single step. Resistance to desegregation in Louisiana was fierce. White citizens' councils sprang up across the state, attempting to block integration through legal and economic pressure. Politicians railed against federal mandates. Some school boards closed schools rather than integrate them. But slowly, the barriers fell. Not because the system wanted change, but because enough people demanded it. College campuses became battlegrounds, too. Southern University in Baton Rouge, one of the nation's largest historically black colleges, was the site of protests and sit-ins throughout the 1960s. Students risked arrest, expulsion, and violence for the right to vote, to study, to live with dignity. In 1972, tragedy struck when 2 students, Leonard Brown and Denver Smith, were shot and killed by police during a peaceful demonstration. Their deaths were a grim reminder that even after laws changed, power often did not surrender quietly. But the fight was not just political, it was cultural. Music, always a lifeblood in Louisiana, became a form of resistance and celebration. Zydeco, born in the Creole communities of southwest Louisiana, fused Cajun rhythms with blues and R&B, telling stories in French and English, often about struggle, survival, and joy. Clifton Chenier, the king of Zydeco, took the accordion from the porch to the stage, and his music brought Louisiana's backroads to national radio. Meanwhile, jazz, once the sound of rebellion, evolved again. From Louis Armstrong to Allen Toussaint, from Fats Domino to Dr. John, New Orleans continued to reinvent itself sonically, even as it clung to its roots. Funk, bounce, brass bands, all became part of a living tradition that honored the past while electrifying the present. And then there was the Superdome. Opened in 1975, it was more than just a stadium. It was a statement. A massive concrete arena rising from the streets of New Orleans, designed to host everything from football to Mardi Gras balls. It was futuristic and proud, built in the heart of a city known for its old world charm. But it was also a symbol of contradictions. While millions were spent on its construction, many neighborhoods nearby struggled with poverty, unemployment, and decaying infrastructure. The dome became a metaphor. Modern Louisiana rising on top of a history it hadn't fully reckoned with. Politics in the state reflected the same tension. The civil rights victories had forced open the doors of government, but power still moved slowly. African Americans began winning seats on city councils, in the legislature, and eventually in the mayor's office. In 1977, New Orleans elected Dutch Morial as its first black mayor, a major milestone for a city that had once jailed men like Homer Plessy. Morial brought reform, but also had to navigate the entrenched interests of a system not designed for people like him. Throughout the state, the push for justice continued. Legal battles over housing, employment, and education dragged on. Laws changed, but lived reality often did not. Police brutality, economic inequality, and environmental racism remained persistent. The petrochemical boom had enriched the state, but had also poisoned it. And in many black communities, especially along the river corridor, Cancer rates soared. The prosperity of the boom years had come with a price, and once again, it was the poorest who paid it. Yet the resilience of Louisiana's people never wavered. Culture remained a force more powerful than any policy. Second-line parades danced through the streets in defiance of despair. Mardi Gras Indians stitched suits with stories in every bead. Cajun and Creole traditions, once dismissed as backwards or exotic, were now celebrated on stages and screens. In the schools, Black history began to be taught. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The memory of Ruby Bridges, the legacy of Homer Plessy, the music of the bayous. They became part of the curriculum, part of the state's conscience. And though racism still lingered in policy and practice, it could no longer hide behind silence. By the close of the century, Louisiana had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably. It had moved from a place where children had to be escorted by marshals to go to school, to a place where those same children could run for office, perform on national stages, and tell their stories in their own voices. The road had been long, the victories hard-won, and the losses heavy. But the power of protest and culture had proven stronger than segregation and silence. And while the spotlight sometimes moved elsewhere, Louisiana never left the stage. It continued to speak, to sing, to fight, to remember. Chapter 14. Hurricane Katrina. By the early 2000s, Louisiana had weathered centuries of change. Colonial rule, slavery, civil war, civil rights, oil booms, cultural revolutions. It was a state defined by resilience. And at the heart of that resilience stood New Orleans, a city that had survived every storm history threw at it. But in the summer of 2005, a different kind of storm approached. This time, the wind would not pass. The water would not recede, and the scars would not fade. Hurricane Katrina began as another name on a list, one more tropical threat in a region used to boarding windows and waiting out the season. But by the time it entered the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina had become a monster. Fueled by warm waters and poor timing, the storm strengthened rapidly, growing into a Category 5 beast with winds topping 175 miles per hour. On Sunday, August 28, 2005, officials issued an urgent call. Evacuate. Mandatory. Get out now. Some did. Thousands of cars streamed out of New Orleans, clogging interstates, fleeing north. But tens of thousands did not. Some stayed by choice, hardened by experience, skeptical of false alarms. Others stayed because they had no choice. No car, no money, nowhere to go. The city, after all, was one of the poorest in the country. Entire neighborhoods lived paycheck to paycheck. When the order came to run, many simply couldn't. Katrina made landfall on August 29th. It struck southeast Louisiana and the Mississippi Gulf Coast with fury. Winds tore off rooftops, toppled trees, and shredded power lines. Storm surge overwhelmed the levees and canals designed to protect the city. And then came the water. The flooding of New Orleans did not come from the storm itself. It came from failure. Engineering failure, government failure. The levees and flood walls, built over decades by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, gave way under the pressure. Breaches opened along the Industrial Canal, the 17th Street Canal, and the London Avenue Canal. Water poured into the city like a silent invasion. Within hours, entire neighborhoods were underwater. The lower 9th Ward was drowned. Gentilly, Lakeview, New Orleans East, all submerged. Elderly residents drowned in attics. Families climbed onto rooftops with handmade signs begging for help. Hospitals lost power. Bodies floated down streets. And still, no help arrived. For days, the city descended into chaos. The Superdome, designated as a shelter of last resort, became a scene of desperation, sweltering heat, overflowing toilets, no food, no medicine. At the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center, thousands more gathered, abandoned by every level of government. People died waiting for buses that didn't come, and all the while, the cameras rolled. The world watched, horrified, as the richest nation on earth failed to save its own. The response was slow, disorganized, and deadly. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was overwhelmed, unprepared, and riddled with miscommunication. Local and state officials scrambled for answers. The federal government hesitated. President George W. Bush, flying over the destruction in Air Force One, became an emblem of the detachment. Trust collapsed alongside the levees. And through it all, the suffering was not equally distributed. Katrina exposed what many already knew, but few wanted to confront. Race and poverty still shaped life and death in America. The neighborhoods hit hardest were overwhelmingly black and low income. The people left behind, the ones blamed in headlines and demonized on screens, were the same people who had been ignored for decades. Katrina didn't just flood a city, it revealed it. Nearly 2,000 people died. Over 1 million were displaced. Whole communities vanished overnight. Families scattered across states: Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, Dallas. Many would never return. Some didn't live long enough to try. And yet, even in the darkest hours, Louisiana's old resilience stirred. Neighbors rescued neighbors in boats. Fishermen became first responders. Churches opened doors. Strangers shared food. Local radio stations stayed on air, broadcasting pleas for help and updates when no one else could. In time, the waters receded. The dead were counted. The damage surveyed. Rebuilding began, but it was slow and uneven. Insurance battles dragged on. Federal aid was delayed. Wealthier neighborhoods bounced back quickly, aided by resources and connections. Poorer areas, especially the lower Ninth Ward, were left to rot. Bulldozers cleared debris, but not everyone's home, not everyone's story. Katrina changed the physical landscape of Louisiana, but it also reshaped its soul. It triggered a mass migration out of New Orleans, permanently lowering the city's population. It upended politics, exposed institutional rot, and sparked new conversations about race, inequality, and climate resilience. In schools, in art, in music, in law, Katrina became a dividing line, before the storm and after. The cultural response was immediate and profound. Musicians told the story in brass and blues. Poets wrote about drowning and survival. Filmmakers documented the pain and the questions. Where was the help? Why were certain communities left behind? What kind of country fails its own people when they need it most? And amid the anger and trauma, new voices rose. Grassroots organizations formed to rebuild not just homes, but justice. Young leaders returned, determined to reimagine the city on new terms. Activists fought for housing, environmental safety, and accountability. They carried the memory of the floodwaters like a warning and a mission. Katrina had exposed the cracks in the system, but it also awakened a fierce determination not to let the same disaster happen again. New investments were made in levees, pumps, and flood control. Billions were spent to armor the city against future storms. But questions remained. Could any wall truly hold back the next great surge? Could resilience be built out of concrete alone? In the years that followed, Hurricanes came and went, some near misses, others direct hits. But Louisiana was different now, wiser perhaps, more skeptical of promises, more insistent on being heard. The trauma of 2005 never fully faded, but neither did the defiance. Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster made worse by human failure. It drowned a city, displaced a people, and shook a nation. But it did not erase Louisiana. It did not silence its music or wash away its spirit. It became a new chapter in a long, hard story, a story of survival against impossible odds. Chapter 15. Louisiana Today. In the long shadow of Hurricane Katrina, Louisiana has emerged not as a state fully healed, but as one still reckoning with the past while staring down the future. The levees are higher now, the emergency plans are better, but the threats have not gone away. In fact, they've multiplied. And as the world shifts beneath everyone's feet, Louisiana once again finds itself at the front lines of something bigger, something slow, creeping, and irreversible. Water has always shaped Louisiana's identity. Rivers, swamps, bayous, and the Gulf itself have defined its economy and its culture for centuries. But today, that same water is swallowing the land. Each year, Louisiana loses roughly a football field's worth of coastline every hour. Barrier islands vanish, marshes retreat. Towns that once sat safely inland now find themselves surrounded by rising tides. The state is quite literally disappearing. This coastal erosion is not just natural, it's engineered. Decades of levee construction, canal dredging, and oil exploration have disrupted the delicate balance of the wetlands. Salt water intrudes where fresh water once flowed. The sediment that built up Louisiana's delta no longer reaches the coastline. Pipelines carve scars through the marsh, and as the seas rise, the soil sinks. A slow-motion disaster unfolds, largely invisible to those who don't live near it. Climate change makes it worse. The hurricanes are stronger, wetter, more frequent. The heat waves last longer. The rain falls harder. And each new disaster doesn't fully fade before the next one begins. Communities rebuild again and again, but the losses add up, economically, psychologically, spiritually. In places like Grand Isle, Cameron Parish, and Isle de Jean Charles, the question is no longer if people will leave, but when, and where they'll go. Yet Louisiana keeps pumping oil and gas. The state's economy still leans heavily on the energy sector, which provides jobs, tax revenue, and political influence. Refineries line the Mississippi River. Natural gas facilities dot the landscape. Offshore rigs stretch out into the Gulf. It's a proud legacy of innovation, of toughness, of feeding the nation's energy needs. But it's also a paradox. The very industry that helped build modern Louisiana contributes to the crisis that now threatens its future. Policymakers walk a tightrope, balancing economic survival with environmental urgency. Debates over renewable energy, carbon emissions, and climate policy rage in the legislature, in local elections, and at kitchen tables. Some argue for transition, others argue for defense. Everyone, it seems, agrees the situation is unsustainable, but no one agrees on how to fix it. The politics of the state mirror this tension. Deeply conservative in recent decades, Louisiana often votes Republican in national elections, even as its urban centers lean blue. Social issues divide communities. Economic concerns dominate campaigns. Corruption scandals continue to plague public trust. But beneath the partisan noise, many Louisianans, regardless of politics, share the same concerns: jobs, storms, schools, safety. The accents may vary, but the worries are familiar. And yet, Even amid crisis, Louisiana's soul refuses to quiet down. Its culture remains one of the most vivid in America. The food is still second to none. Gumbo simmering on the stove, crawfish piled high at weekend boils, beignets powdered in sugar, and eaten before the plate cools. Every meal is a memory. Every bite is an argument about who makes it best. Faith runs deep, braided into everyday life. Catholicism remains dominant, but evangelical churches grow in numbers and influence. Vodou persists in the shadows, not as a curiosity, but as part of family tradition. Religious festivals, gospel choirs, and processions fill the calendar. In Louisiana, belief is not kept quiet. It sings, it marches, it eats with you at the table. And then there's the music, still unstoppable. Jazz echoes through the streets of New Orleans, reborn in each generation. Zydeco gets blasted from back porches in Lafayette. Hip-hop has found its own swagger in Baton Rouge and beyond. Brass bands roam the French Quarter. Accordion riffs spill out of roadside bars. No other place sounds quite like it. Festivals remain the heartbeat of the calendar. Mardi Gras, of course, reigns supreme, with beads, parades, and king cakes announcing the season long before Lent arrives. But there are hundreds more. Shrimp festivals, strawberry festivals, French heritage festivals, Creole celebrations, second lines, and saints' days. Every small town has its moment to shine. Every community finds a reason to dance. And in those moments, on the parade routes, at the food stalls, behind the masks, Louisiana's pride becomes palpable. It is not just celebration, it is declaration. We are still here. The storms did not wash us away. The floods did not erase us. The politics may divide us, but the music still brings us back. The state's population reflects its history. French surnames sit alongside Vietnamese, Haitian, Honduran, and Congolese ones. After the Vietnam War, Louisiana welcomed thousands of Vietnamese refugees who brought fishing skills, hard work, and new flavors to the Gulf. In recent years, Latino immigrants have filled vital roles in agriculture, construction, and hospitality. Louisiana is changing, not rapidly, but undeniably. The old is not disappearing, but it is sharing space with the new. In its schools, students still learn about the Mississippi River, about Robert E. Lee, about the Civil War. But more are also learning about Ruby Bridges, Plessy versus Ferguson, and the long arc of the civil rights struggle. The curriculum, like the state itself, wrestles with how to tell its story, truthfully, fully, and with room for all who've lived it. The future remains uncertain. The coastline continues to retreat. Oil prices rise and fall. Political tensions simmer. But through it all, the people of Louisiana endure. They fill their homes with laughter and flavor. They protect their communities with grit and grace. They mourn together, rebuild together, and celebrate with unmatched style. Louisiana today is a state of contradictions, coastal yet sinking, wealthy in resources yet poor in many communities, politically divided yet culturally united. It is a place where the past never stays buried, where the present feels like a storm, and where the future still flickers with stubborn hope. It has never been easy. It was never supposed to be. But Louisiana has never been about ease. It is about survival, about beauty carved from hardship, about identity forged in floodwaters, in music, in fire, in food, and faith. It is, still and always, unmistakably itself. Chapter 16. The Soul of Louisiana. To understand Louisiana is to accept that it resists simple explanation. It is a place built on contradiction, stitched together by flood and fire, by exile and celebration, by faith, rhythm, violence, and resilience. It is French and American, Catholic and Protestant, black and white and Creole and something in between. It is rich in resources, poor in outcomes. It is joyful in defiance of pain, and tragic without ever losing its appetite for life. And yet, despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, Louisiana is whole. Complicated, battered, vibrant, but whole. No other place in the United States has a history that feels quite so mythic and raw at the same time. The myths are well known. The elegance of antebellum mansions, the mystery of voodoo queens, the music that spills from brass instruments in a crowded French quarter street. But beneath the postcard images lies something deeper, a people shaped by centuries of struggle and survival, who have learned to live with ghosts, find beauty in ruin. Louisiana is not an idea you visit. It is a feeling you absorb. Walk through New Orleans at dawn, and the contradictions hang in the air like humidity. You'll see churches and bars on the same block, jazz funerals that laugh through grief, historic buildings leaning against each other like old friends. You'll pass murals of lost legends, kids playing in the street, old men talking politics and weather with the same reverence. And somewhere, someone is cooking, always. Because in Louisiana, food is never just a meal. It is memory, ritual, love, and proof that no matter what else breaks, flavor endures. The land, too, speaks. From the rolling pine forests of the north to the dripping cypress swamps of the south. From the shrinking coastline to the wide, stubborn Mississippi. Louisiana is a landscape in motion, never quite stable, never quite settled. Hurricanes reshape towns. Levees rise and fail. River currents carry silt, stories, and loss. This is not a state that was tamed. It is a state negotiated with, and yet its people have always found ways to remain rooted. Generations live within miles of where their ancestors were born, their family names echoing through parish records and gravestones. Even when the storms scatter them, they return. Or if they don't, they carry Louisiana with them. Its drawl in their speech, its spices in their cooking, its sorrow in their music. There's a reason so many great artists, musicians, and writers have emerged from Louisiana. This is a place where expression is survival. Jazz was not just entertainment, it was resistance. The blues did not simply reflect sadness, they metabolized it. Cajun and Creole music, Zydeco and bounce, gospel and funk. They didn't come from institutions. They came from porches, from churches, from dirt-floor dance halls and shotgun houses, from families who understood that when the world won't listen, you make your own rhythm and speak louder. That same energy pulses through its politics. Louisiana has long been a theater of bold, flamboyant leaders and backroom deals. Its corruption has been legendary, its populists unforgettable. But even in the cynicism, there is a truth. This is a state where people demand to be seen. They may not always agree on how it should be governed, but they are rarely apathetic. They fight hard. They vote. They argue. They protest. They cheer. They care. Even when trust is thin, identity runs thick. The story of Louisiana has always been one of margins, of people who were pushed aside and yet made something powerful in the space they were given. Enslaved Africans created culture that would change the world. Exiled Acadians forged a new language and cuisine. Immigrant laborers laid tracks and built levees. Native peoples, often displaced, still hold fast to memory and land. Each wave of arrivals brought pain and potential, and from the collisions came something strange and beautiful. There is pain here, always. You can taste it in the music, see it in flood lines etched into brick walls, feel it in the stories passed from grandmother to grandchild. The pain is not hidden, but it is not the end of the story. The soul of Louisiana has always been in what comes after the pain, in the laughter that follows loss, in the dancing that refuses to stop, in the rebuilding, again and again, with hands that know the work and hearts that refuse to give up. To say that Louisiana is defined by contradiction is not to call it broken. It is to recognize that it contains multitudes, that it refuses simplicity, that it can be deeply conservative and wildly creative, that it can mourn and celebrate in the same breath, that it can be shaped by centuries of exploitation and still overflow with generosity. The hurricanes will keep coming. The coastline will keep retreating. The politics will rise and fall like the tide. But Louisiana will not vanish. It will bend and shift and sing and cook and mourn and dance and fight and rebuild. It always has. And perhaps that is the heart of Louisiana. Not a place, but a rhythm. A rhythm that refuses to be silenced, that swings even in sorrow, that survives where others would stop, that turns contradiction into culture, disaster into defiance, and survival into art. The story is not over. It never is. Louisiana is still being written by the young people remixing tradition, by the chefs reinventing gumbo, by the activists fighting for justice, by the elders passing down songs and stories, by the poets trying to make sense of it all. It is a story told in many languages, with many accents, by people who will never fully agree on what it means, only that it matters. To know Louisiana is to accept its complications. To love it is to celebrate them. And to understand its history is to realize that its future, though uncertain, will be written not with fear, but with the same bold, stubborn, glorious spirit that has carried it this far. This is Louisiana, its soul undivided, its music unbroken, its people unbowed.